If you're writing contemporary fiction of any kind, so that could be a novel or a short story or a novella that is set in the present day, then you might have come across the question of whether you should address the COVID-19 pandemic in your story or just leave it out entirely. This is something I've been thinking about a lot recently with novels that I've been editing, and frankly, it's a tough call. As a writer of contemporary fiction, you want your story to feel current, whether it is picked up today or picked up in 5 years, and so you might want to avoid referencing any specific events. But at the same time, if your story is set in our contemporary world, how do you not address this elephant in the room, considering something like the pandemic that has been so far-reaching and touched every life on Earth? As we know, every major event in history makes its way into literature in one way or another and is handled in different ways, but it feels awkward right now because we're still living through it. So honestly, I want to give you just my personal opinions and some thoughts that I've had regarding how to effectively reference the pandemic in your story, and whether you even need to reference it at all. If you are working on a fiction story of any kind, or you're interested in potentially publishing a book one day, I recommend subscribing to my channel. Every single week, I either offer writing tips like today, or I give you insight into the publishing industry. So if any of that interests you, I would love to have you around. So to answer the question of whether or not the pandemic belongs in your story and how to talk about it if it does, we're going to talk through several different factors that you'll need to consider. The first factor is to really think about the world in which your story takes place. And I want you to ask yourself a series of questions about it. First, is your story taking place in a fantastical world that really operates on a different plane, maybe a different dimension than the world that we are currently living in? Or is it really supposed to be realistic contemporary fiction that feels like it is taking place in our present moment? Or is it potentially taking place in the near future world that feels a lot like the one we're currently in, but is maybe just a few years out? This is really important because I think the answer to whether or not you need to address the pandemic in your story really comes back to the world that it's taking place in. If the story is taking place in a fantastical realm, then I think it's pretty straightforward that you don't necessarily need to reference the pandemic unless you want to. Unless you want to make that a part of the story of the world that your characters are experiencing, then you don't necessarily need to talk about it because the reader is going to accept that world as entirely separate from our own. It's not going to feel like something is missing if that world doesn't have our shared history. Now, if you are writing a story that takes place in our realistic contemporary world, or the near future world that is really meant to be our world now but just fast forwarded a few years, then that's when you really need to consider if bringing up the pandemic makes sense in the context of your story. To answer that, I'm going to pose a follow-up question, which is, does it matter what specific year your story is taking place in? Now, I'm referencing this in the context of your story either taking place in our contemporary world or in the near future world. Does the actual year that the story is following, that the characters are living and breathing in, matter or not? I ask this because if the specific year doesn't really matter and it could just as easily be 2018 or 2022, then I actually recommend just not referencing the year at all. I know as a writer, sometimes you might feel compelled to have to put a date at the beginning of your chapters or put a date at the beginning of your story, but there's no rule saying you have to. You don't have to say what year it is unless the year actually plays a role in the story. So we're in a situation now where I feel like a lot of writers who otherwise wouldn't necessarily have defined a year for their story are setting everything in 2019 because you don't want to address the pandemic, but you still want it to be contemporary. So now all of these novels and stories are happening in 2019. And I totally get that tendency, but I think in those cases, you really can just remove the year. And unless there is specific things going on in your story that trigger a revelation to the reader that it's a certain year or a certain event has passed in recent history, then the reader will accept, okay, this is our, kind of normal contemporary space. Now let's talk about the other situation in which you do have to define the specific year in which the story takes place because you reference some kind of background event or historical event that happened. Obviously, if the story is taking place in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, any of the near future years, as well as 2020 and 2021, you're gonna have to say something about the pandemic because it's gonna feel like an elephant in the room if you don't address it. However, before moving forward with that, I would go back to the overarching question of if the novel actually does need to take place in one of those years, or if it would just as well operate in an undefined contemporary period. The reason I want you to ask that question is because, frankly, it's going to be easier if you avoid any reference to the pandemic at all, especially if you're writing about it while we're still living it right now in 2021. However, if you do feel compelled to talk about it, I don't want you to shy away from it if that is part of the vision for your story. So let's talk about how to talk about and write about the pandemic in a way that is effective. The next thing you want to do after determining whether or not you need to discuss the pandemic in your contemporary fiction is figure out how it will have impacted your characters' lives. It's integral to make sure that the impacts that your characters are feeling and the experiences that they are having, whether the pandemic is happening contemporarily in your story or it happened in the near past in your story. If you go this route, it is really, really important that you integrate the pandemic in such a way that it doesn't feel like an afterthought. So if you're writing a 70,000 word novel, it should not just be one sentence, in the first chapter. It should be referenced throughout because we are going to expect the characters to be living and breathing in that moment, and we will expect for them to have certain effects and certain consequences that came about due to the pandemic, and you'll want to explore those wholeheartedly and authentically. So some questions to consider here are, did your character contract COVID, or did they have a family member or a loved one who did, or did they know anyone who unfortunately passed due to the disease? Where was your character during the lockdown period when we were not advised to go out for any non-essential purpose? And who were they with during that period? Did your character suffer any professional or financial hardship or loss during the pandemic, such as their investments tanking with the stock market crash or the loss of their job due to layoffs? Or did your character make any major life changes, as so many people have during the pandemic, such as moving to a new place, or starting a new job, or having a child, or adopting a pet, or starting a relationship? There have been so many ways in which the pandemic has influenced every single aspect of our lives that there's actually a lot of really rich areas for you to explore your characters' experiences of it and how they've developed personally due to the situation that the pandemic presented them. So in addition to thinking through how exactly the pandemic has influenced your characters' lives, remember to be consistent with any practicalities that your characters would have to enact when they are living and breathing during that time, such as wearing a mask when they go outside, or washing their hands when they get home, or whenever they touch anything, or working from home or having modified office schedules. Make sure that it feels like your characters are living throughout that time through the routine actions that they are taking. My last tip for writing about the pandemic, if you determine it's critical to your story, is to ensure you are being sensitive. Something you need to realize is that readers are going to, whether you like it or not, or whether they intend to or not, think about their own experiences of the pandemic when they are reading your fictional story. So you want to ensure that you aren't alienating anyone who had a different experience from your characters. So just make sure that you are acknowledging the breadth of experiences and the breadth of hardship that people have had. At the same time, you don't want to brush things off or skirt around the topic, because readers will likely be turned off if the pandemic is referenced in your story, but then it isn't given enough exploration and attention in how the story plays out itself. So if you're gonna go there, you need to go there fully. Now, if your characters have had a different experience of the pandemic than you've had. So maybe they are in a different city or in a different country than maybe you were in during the pandemic. Then it's worth doing a little bit of research to see how that region experienced it and what kind of situations they faced, because as we know, regional differences have been so huge in the whole progression of this thing. So you want to make sure you do that so someone from that place or someone who was there at the time doesn't read your story and then think it doesn't match up with what they actually know to have happened. The same thing goes if you're writing about a character who got sick but you did not. Make sure you are portraying that experience as authentically as possible. My last tip is don't presume anything before it happens. So as we know, the pandemic is not over yet. The virus is still around. We're still dealing with weird changes every single day. So make sure that your story doesn't create a reality that we haven't achieved yet. And that's because it might sound a little bit tone deaf. For example, if your story is set in 2021 and the virus is fully eradicated. Maybe you can experiment with these types of alternate histories once the pandemic is much, much further in the past. But while we're still living it, I would say try to remain true to the experience that everyone knows and is familiar with. And don't necessarily predict or presume the future, because that might rub readers the wrong way. So I hope these tips helped you kind of sort through this messy and weird topic of whether you should address the pandemic in your work of contemporary fiction. It's something I'm honestly still working through, as you probably could tell as I was talking through it in this video. So I'm really excited to read your comments and just hear how you've thought about this, if you've thought about it, if this video made you feel differently about it, or just what kinds of comments that you have. If you found this video interesting at all, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. If you are working on any type of story, I would love to have you around, because every week I post a new video talking about either writing or publishing. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.